Upper Platte, Wyoming Territory, August 1873. The air was thin and clear, smelling of dust and distant pine, and the sun baked the high plains with an intensity that made the memory of winter a distant fiction. But winter was the only thing on Matej Kral's mind. He was not building a cabin. He was building a defense against a known enemy. And to his neighbors, it looked like madness. The walls of his small structure were low, barely high enough for a man to stand upright in the center, built of sturdy cottonwood logs, chinked thick with prairie sod. This was normal. What was happening on top was not. Lying beside the half-finished cabin was the prize he had spent 3 weeks hauling from a creek bed 2 miles away, a colossal windfall oak, felled by a windstorm years ago, its wood seasoned hard as iron. He had spent the last month with wedges, a maul, and endless patience, splitting the 12-foot section of trunk down its length. Now, 2 enormous curved wooden shells lay on the ground, each one a single, solid piece of timber 4 feet across. Using a system of levers, log rollers, and the sheer straining power of his 2 oxen, Matej was attempting to maneuver the first half onto the cabin's wall plates. It was a slow, groaning, precarious process. Every settler within a mile had stopped their work to watch the spectacle. Among them was Amos Pike, a freight hauler, whose opinion carried the weight of the goods he transported. He stood with his arms crossed, a wad of tobacco in his cheek, his face a mask of derisive certainty. "What in God's name does the Moravian think he's doing?" Pike said, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for all to hear. Silas Croft, a farmer who prided himself on his perfectly square-notched corners, shook his head. "It's a fool's errand, Amos. That thing must weigh a ton. It'll crush his walls flat by the first snow." "It's not the weight that'll get him," Pike countered, spitting a brown stream of juice into the dust. He was a man who understood the prairie's subtle cruelties. "It's the rot. He's putting it bark up. Every drop of rain, every bit of meltwater, is going to channel right into the heartwood. It'll be a sodden, spongy mess in a year." He paused, letting his pronouncement settle over the little crowd. "He's building a monument to his own foolishness. It will rot, it will crush his rafters, and it will shame every honest builder in this valley." Matej heard them. He had heard them for weeks. He offered no argument, no defense. His face, weathered and quiet, remained focused on the task. The massive half-log tilted, balanced for a heart-stopping moment on the edge of the wall, and then, with a final shuddering groan from the oxen and a shove from Matej's shoulder, it settled into place. It looked absurd. A low, dirt-walled box with a giant, curved piece of a tree for a roof. It looked less like a home, and more like something a giant child had discarded. The laughter started then, not cruel, but baffled and dismissive. This was the raw frontier, a place that punished mistakes with brutal finality. And Matej Kral, the quiet man from a land no one could find on a map, was making the biggest mistake they had ever seen. What did this Moravian cooper, a man who built barrels for a living, understand about the physics of convection that these seasoned, expert frontiersmen, men who had built dozens of cabins and survived dozens of winters, had so completely missed? The answer to that question would not be found in arguments or explanations. It would arrive on the back of the deadliest winter Wyoming had seen in a decade, a winter that would test every nail, every seam, and every conviction. Before you see how this strange roof performed in that crucible, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. I promise, by the end of this story, you will understand the hidden forces at work inside your own home and appreciate the simple genius of a man who thought differently. Let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional building trick you've ever seen that actually worked. Matej Kral was not a carpenter. He had never framed a barn, never shingled a roof, never built the tall, handsome, square-cornered cabins that dotted the American West. He was a bednaz, a cooper, from a small village in Moravia, where his family had been making barrels for 200 years. His world was not one of straight lines and right angles. It was a world of curves, staves, and immense, invisible pressures. His hands knew the language of oak grain, the precise moisture content at which a stave would bend without breaking, the exact force a steel hoop needed to exert to create a vessel that could hold liquid for a generation without losing a single drop. He thought in terms of sealed systems. A barrel wasn't just a container. It was a fortress against the outside world, designed to protect what was within from leakage, evaporation, and contamination. He had brought his wife, Aneta, and their 2 children, 8-year-old Jakob and 6-year-old Zofia, to America for the promise of land. But their first winter in Wyoming, spent in a hastily built conventional log cabin, had been a lesson in a different kind of pressure. The cold. It was a physical presence, a relentless thief. Matej had done everything he was told. He had chinked the log walls with mud and moss until not a sliver of light showed through. He had built a stone fireplace that drew beautifully, and still, the cold won. Aneta would wake in the mornings to find the edges of their wool blankets stiff with frost, right where their breath had condensed and frozen during the night. The cup of coffee Matej set by the bed would be lukewarm before he'd pulled his boots on. The most damning evidence was the smoke. On windy nights, he would watch the flame of their single candle. It didn't just flicker, it bent, pulled sideways by an invisible river of air flowing through the cabin. The smoke from the hearth, instead of rising cleanly, would often curl down and snake along the floor before being sucked up the chimney. His home was breathing, inhaling icy air from 100 tiny gaps and exhaling the precious warmth he spent all day cutting wood to create. The family was never truly warm. They ate with their coats on. The children were always coughing. Matej, the master of sealed vessels, was living in a sieve. The problem wasn't the walls. The problem was the roof. He watched his neighbors suffer the same fate. They all used the standard construction, a central ridgepole supported by gable ends, with smaller rafters running down to the walls, covered with a layer of brush or planks, and topped with a thick layer of sod. It was a proven method. It was also fundamentally flawed. The conventional failure of a frontier cabin roof was a simple matter of physics, a process that happened invisibly but with devastating effect. The primary culprit was convection. Heat, as every school child knows, rises. In a cabin, the wood stove or fireplace heats the air, reducing its density and causing it to ascend. A single cord of seasoned pine, burned over 24 hours, releases approximately 20 million British thermal units, or BTUs, of heat energy. In a perfectly sealed space, this would raise the temperature to unbearable levels. But the space was never sealed. The rising column of warm air carrying the vast majority of those precious BTUs traveled straight up to the highest point, the roof. And there, it met an enemy far more insidious than the log walls: seams, dozens of them. Every point where a rafter met the ridgepole was a seam. Every point where a rafter rested on the wall plate was a seam. The sod and planks laid over them could reduce the airflow, but they could never eliminate it. A typical 12 by 16-foot cabin roof had over 200 linear feet of such seams. For the warm, pressurized air inside, these tiny gaps were escape valves. Worse, the prairie wind acted as a powerful engine driving this process. As wind blows over the peak of a roof, it creates a small area of lower pressure, a principle of fluid dynamics. This low-pressure zone acts like a vacuum, actively pulling the warm air up and out of the cabin through the roof seams. This is called the stack effect. It's the reason smoke is drawn up a chimney. In a conventional cabin, the entire roof acted as a leaky, inefficient chimney. The harder the wind blew, the faster the cabin's warmth was stolen. The settlers were in a constant battle, feeding their stoves endlessly, not to heat their homes, but to heat the Wyoming sky. Matej watched them, saw the endless columns of smoke shredded by the wind, and knew they were fighting the wrong war. The problem wasn't making more heat. The problem was keeping the heat they already had. The solution, he decided, had to be a roof with no seams. A single, monolithic cap. A lid. His work began not with an axe, but with a search. He needed a tree that was already dead, already seasoned, and already on the ground. Green wood would shrink, check, and crack as it dried, creating the very seams he sought to eliminate. He found it half buried in the silt of a dry creek bed. A massive oak, toppled years ago, its bark still intact and its heartwood protected. He knew oak. He knew its tight grain was nearly waterproof. He knew how it resisted rot when kept properly. The labor was immense. Getting the 12-foot section of trunk back to his homestead took a week of agonizing effort with his oxen, using log rollers and brute force. Then came the splitting. He couldn't saw it. No saw he owned was large enough. He had to split it, as he would a barrel stave, but on a gargantuan scale. He studied the grain, finding the perfect line. For days, the only sounds from his plot of land were the rhythmic thump of his maul driving iron wedges into the wood, punctuated by the sharp crack as the fibers gave way. He turned the log a quarter turn and did it again, eventually freeing two massive curved halves. He laid the foundation for the cabin walls, setting them lower and wider than his neighbors. He needed stability. When the walls were up, the real work began. He built a temporary earthen ramp against one wall. With his oxen pulling and every ounce of his strength pushing and levering, he slowly, painstakingly worked the first half log up the ramp until it teetered on the wall plate. This was the moment Amos Pike had delivered his confident verdict. After the first piece was in place, Matej spent a day shaping the flat, split side, using an adze to hollow it out slightly, creating a shallow, concave surface. He did the same for the second half. When he finally wrestled the second half log into place next to the first, they met with a satisfying thud. The two halves formed a solid, arching roof over his low-slung cabin. There was no ridgepole. There were no rafters. There was only one seam running straight down the middle where the two halves met. For this, he turned back to his cooper's trade. He carved a shallow, V-shaped groove along the edge of each half log. Into this groove, he hammered a long, dry spline of aspen wood. Then, he poured hot pine pitch, which he'd been rendering for days, into the entire length of the channel. The pitch soaked into the dry aspen, causing it to swell and form a perfect, waterproof, and airtight seal. The final touch was to pack the gable ends not with logs, but with a dense mixture of sod and clay, sealing the front and back. Amos Pike came by again as Matej was finishing. "You've made yourself a tomb, Kral," he said, shaking his head. "That pitch will crack in the cold. And what happens when the snow load comes? A proper roof has a steep pitch to shed the weight. That thing is just a cradle to hold it. It's going to collapse and bury your family." Matej looked up from his work, his hands black with pitch. He simply pointed at the bark. "Bark is a roof," he said. "Nature's roof. It sheds water for 100 years while the tree is standing. It will do so for me." He returned to his work, leaving Pike to stare at the bizarre structure. It was low, dark, and looked half buried, like a badger's den. It had none of the proud, angular beauty of a traditional cabin. It looked humble. It looked patient. It was waiting for the winter. To understand the genius of Matej's design, you have to understand the three ways heat moves: conduction, radiation, and convection. Conduction is heat transfer through direct contact. Radiation is heat transfer through electromagnetic waves. But in a windy, cold environment like Wyoming, convection is the king of heat loss. Convection is heat transfer through the movement of fluids, in this case, air. As we've established, the 20 million BTUs from a cord of wood go into heating the air inside the cabin. This creates a volume of warm, buoyant air that immediately wants to rise. Think of it as a hot air balloon inside a box. In a standard cabin, this balloon pushes up against the roof, where it finds hundreds of feet of tiny cracks and seams. Even with sod insulation, which is a poor conductor of heat, the moving air will find a path. A 1/8 inch gap along a 16-foot ridgepole is 2 square feet of open window that all the heat in the cabin is trying to escape through. Now add wind. The wind blowing over the roof creates a pressure differential. The air pressure outside and above the roof is lower than the air pressure inside the cabin. The universe abhors a pressure difference, and it will try to equalize it. This turns the cabin from a leaky box into an active pump. The wind sucks the warm air out, which in turn pulls cold air in through every crack in the walls and floor. This is why Matej's candle flame bent sideways. He wasn't just fighting the cold outside. He was fighting a constant, wind-driven exchange of his home's entire volume of air. He was trying to heat a river. Matej's oak roof defeated this process in one elegant stroke. By creating a single seamless cap, he eliminated the primary escape route for convective heat loss. There were no seams at the peak. There were no joints between rafters and walls. The rising column of warm air would reach his ceiling and simply stop. It would press against the thick, curved oak, but it had nowhere to go. The heat would have to escape via conduction, slowly, through the dense wood and the sod piled against the gables. But conduction is a far, far slower process than convection. He hadn't just plugged the leaks. He had removed the entire engine of heat loss. The pressure differential created by the wind outside was now irrelevant. It could pull and suck all it wanted. It was pulling against a solid, sealed vessel. He had built a barrel for his family to live in. He had stopped the river. That autumn was deceptively mild. The mockery softened into a kind of pity. The Kral family lived in their strange, dark little hut, and the community watched and waited for the inevitable failure. The first snows were light and dry. Then, in late December, the weather turned. A Chinook wind blew in from the mountains, warm and moist. The temperature climbed 40 degrees in a single afternoon. A wet, heavy snow began to fall, the kind that clings to every surface. It piled up on the roofs of the settlement, a thick, saturated blanket. On a normal roof, some of it would melt and run off. On Matej's shallow, curved roof, it simply accumulated, a massive, sodden weight. "Now we'll see," Silas Croft was heard to remark at the trading post. "That weight will find the weakness." But the oak roof, with the immense strength of its arch, held firm. The true test came 3 days later. The Chinook broke. The wind swung around to the north, and the temperature plunged. In 12 hours, it dropped 70 degrees, from 35 above zero to 35 below. And the wind began to howl. It was a dry, scouring wind that picked up the new snow and blasted it sideways. This was the dreaded Chinook reversal. For the next 11 days, the wind did not stop. It was a physical assault, a constant shrieking pressure that sought out every weakness. The wet, heavy snow that had fallen on every cabin's roof froze into a solid, jagged crust of ice. But the wind still found the seams beneath it, driving the cold in and pulling the warmth out. In Silas Croft's cabin, the chinking between the logs contracted in the cold, opening up dozens of new cracks. They spent their days stuffing rags into the gaps and their nights huddled around a stove that burned red hot but seemed to produce no heat. At Amos Pike's homestead, his wife had to hang blankets over the windows and doors to slow the drafts that made the floor an ice rink. They were burning through their winter wood supply at a terrifying rate. Throughout the settlement, it was the same story, a desperate losing battle against the wind. Inside Matej Kral's cabin, there was silence. The wind shrieked outside, a distant, frustrated howl, but inside, the air was still. The thick, seamless oak roof, now buried under 2 feet of snow and a cap of ice, was performing exactly as he had designed it. The snow, ironically, had become a perfect insulator. The heat from their small stove rose, collected under the curved ceiling, and stayed there. The air stratified, with the warmest layer at the top, but the entire volume of the small cabin was comfortable. Annetta cooked their meals without wearing her heavy coat. The children, Jakob and Zofia, played on a bearskin rug on the floor, not bundled in layers, but in their simple woolens. The domestic warmth was proven not by a thermometer, but by the smell of baking bread that filled the small space, a scent that wasn't immediately ripped away and stolen by drafts. One morning, Annetta left a small pat of butter on a dish on the table, 6 feet from the stove. At noon, it was still soft. This was an impossibility in any other cabin in the territory. They were not just surviving. They were living. On the 9th day of the storm, Amos Pike was in trouble. He had been trying to get a wagon of supplies to a stranded survey camp and had been caught by the full fury of the blizzard's return. He'd lost his way in the whiteout and had been forced to turn back, his 4 mules exhausted from leaning into the wind. By the time he neared the settlement, it was dusk, and the temperature was nearing 40 below. His animals were failing. Their breath froze instantly on their muzzles, encasing them in ice. Their harnesses were stiff as wood. He knew if he couldn't get them into a sheltered spot out of the wind, he would lose them. His own barn was too far. The closest structure was the one he had ridiculed all summer, Matej Kral's half-buried oak-roofed cabin. He had no choice. Swallowing his pride, he guided the exhausted team to the lee side of the structure. The effect was instantaneous. The low, curved profile of the cabin created a perfect windbreak. The air on the downwind side was almost calm. He tethered the mules there, their bodies heaving. He expected to find the Kral family in a desperate state, perhaps worse off than he was. He hammered on the thick plank door. It swung open, and a wave of calm, warm air washed over him. It didn't feel like the scorching, dry heat from a roaring stove, but a deep, pervasive warmth. He saw Matej calm and unworried. He saw Annetta stirring a pot, her face flushed from the heat. He saw the 2 children playing on the floor. There were no blankets hanging, no frantic stuffing of rags. The only sound was the gentle crackle of a modestly burning fire and the distant scream of the wind. "My mules," Pike stammered, the words freezing on his lips. "They're done in. Can I leave them by your wall for the night?" "Of course," Matej said simply, stepping aside to let him in. "Come in, warm yourself." Pike stumbled inside, overwhelmed by the stillness. His own cabin, which was twice the size, and built by a man considered the best carpenter in the region, felt like a wind tunnel by comparison. He stayed for an hour, drinking hot coffee that actually stayed hot in his cup. He watched, bewildered, as Zofia, in her bare feet, chased a small wooden toy across the floorboards. When he finally went back out, he was a changed man. His mules, sheltered from the wind, were already recovering. Their coats, which had been rimed with ice, were now steaming gently in the cold air. The final proof came at dawn. The wind had finally died, leaving behind a world of brutal, silent cold. Pike went to check on his team, and decided to grease their harnesses before attempting the final leg home. He reached into his wagon for the tub of axle grease he always carried. It was frozen solid. The cold had turned it into a waxy, useless rock. He couldn't even make a dent in it with his knife. Frustrated, he walked to Matej's door to thank him. When Matej opened it, Pike saw a similar wooden tub of grease just inside the doorway, used for the same purpose. On a hunch, he asked, "Could I borrow some of that?" Matej nodded, handing him the tub. Pike dipped his fingers into it. The grease was soft, pliable. He stared at his grease-coated fingers, then up at the massive curved oak ceiling inside the cabin, dark and solid above the family's heads. He finally understood. The structure wasn't just a shelter from the cold. It was a different reality. He looked at Matej, his face a mixture of awe and shame. "My God, Kral," Pike said, his voice thick with emotion. He searched for the right words, for a way to describe what he was seeing. "You didn't build a roof." He shook his head slowly. "You built a barrel lid against the sky." Amos Pike, the loudest critic, became the innovation's most fervent evangelist. His job as a freight hauler took him to every camp, fort, and fledgling settlement in the territory, and at every stop, alongside the delivery of flour, salt, and tools, he delivered the story of the Moravian cooper and his seamless roof. He described the soft butter, the steaming mules, the pliable grease. He, a practical man, gave practical proof that other practical men could understand. He called it the cooper's cap, or the Kral roof. The idea was too simple and too effective to ignore. It required no expensive materials, no milled lumber, no complex joinery. It required only a large fallen log, immense labor, and the willingness to build something that looked strange. For men on the frontier, labor was cheap and ridicule was a price they were willing to pay for survival. The following spring, the technique began to spread. Freight camps, which were often temporary, were the first to adopt it. A crew of men could dig a shallow pit, line it with sod walls, and cap it with a split log in a matter of days, creating a winter shelter that was vastly superior to a drafty tent or a hastily built cabin. New settlers, hearing Pike's story, began their homesteading not by searching for the best plot of land, but by searching for the largest, soundest windfall oak or cottonwood. By 1875, travelers along the Platte River noted the strange, low-slung, turtle-like structures dotting the landscape. They were never beautiful, but they were warm. Families reported cutting their winter wood consumption by half, even two-thirds. The cooper's cap didn't just make life more comfortable, it made survival more certain. Matej Kral's frontier innovation was a brilliant, intuitive leap that anticipated the principles of modern building science by nearly a century. Today, architects and engineers talk about the importance of the building envelope, creating an airtight barrier to prevent uncontrolled air leakage. They use blower door tests to pressurize a house and find the leaks, the very same leaks Matej found by watching his candle flame. The concept of a monolithic, seamless roof is a hallmark of high-efficiency construction. Matej's solid oak cap was a primitive but profoundly effective version of the air barriers and continuous insulation that are now standard in passive house design. He understood, without the benefit of formal science, that stopping the stack effect and defeating convective heat loss was the single most important factor in creating a warm, efficient home in a cold climate. He proved that the enemy was not the cold itself, but the air that carried it. That the frontier was a place of brutal honesty. It did not reward credentials or tradition or what was pleasing to the eye. It rewarded what worked. The warmest roof, as Matej Kral demonstrated, is the one that leaves the wind no door. He didn't try to fight the wind's immense power with a stronger fire or thicker walls. He simply built a home on which the wind could find no purchase, no crack, no seam to invade. He made his home irrelevant to the storm. It's a profound lesson. True mastery over a powerful force is rarely achieved through direct opposition. It is achieved by understanding the path that force wants to take and quietly, intelligently, closing the door. Matej Kral didn't defeat the Wyoming winter. He just built a house that it could not enter. If you found this story of frontier ingenuity as fascinating as I did, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of forgotten history and practical wisdom. Your support helps us bring these stories to light. And don't forget to answer our earlier question in the comments. What's the most clever, unconventional solution to a common problem you've ever encountered? This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply historical building methods for modern use should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all current building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.